Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon with us, or for the folks on the West Coast, your Friday morning. My name is Vincent Kwan, and today's webinar is going to focus on J-PAL's Education Technology and Opportunity Innovation Competition. And during today's webinar, we are going to be discussing the competition opportunity, and our presenters today will walk through the experience of working on a rigorous randomized evaluation, and then we'll be answering a lot of questions at the end of the webinar focused on this competition. So I want to start off by quickly introducing our presenters. Once again, my name is Vincent Kwan. I am a Senior Policy Manager here at J-PAL North America, and I am the Initiative Manager for the Education Technology and Opportunity Initiative. Joining us today will be Ariel Khalil, a professor at University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and the co-director of the Behavioral Insights and Parenting Lab.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. And then joining us also will be Susan Mayer, who is a professor emeritus at University of Chicago School of Public Policy and the co-director of the Behavioral Insights and Parenting Lab. And Shane DeRolf, founder and CEO of the Big Word Club, will also be sharing his insights with us today. So we're very excited to have all of our presenters on board today. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. All of the attendees have been muted, but we do encourage folks to use the chat function if they have any questions. We will be curating questions throughout the session, so feel free to just send questions through the chat box throughout the presentation, and we'll be spending the end of the presentation today to answer your chat questions. And of course, for folks who could not attend the webinar today, we are going to be recording this presentation and we'll post it on the website within a week. So I'd like to quickly introduce J-PAL as an organization for those who are not familiar. J-PAL is a research center that's based out of MIT, and our mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by rigorous scientific evidence. And as reflected in this map, J-PAL works all around the world. J-PAL North America, which is where we sit, is a research center based here at MIT and a regional office of J-PAL, and really focuses on bringing J-PAL's approach and mission to reduce poverty in the North America region. Beyond the North America region, we also have regional offices in Africa, Europe, Latin America, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So how does J-PAL tackle and fight poverty? We specifically focus on impact evaluations of social programs, and we approach poverty through a broad lens and therefore tackle a wide range of policy areas, including education, healthcare, crime and violence, labor and employment, agriculture, energy, and many other policy areas that may have some type of relationship with poverty. And what distinguishes J-PAL from other research institutions is our sole focus on using randomized evaluations to figure out which programs work, which work best, and why. And collectively, we've done more than 900 ongoing and completed randomized evaluations in 80 countries. Our rigorous research is led by our network of more than 150 affiliated professors who sit at 56 different universities around the world. And they together produce the research by leading the evaluations as our principal investigators. So while J-PAL is a research center that's based at MIT, our network of affiliated professors sit at universities all around the world. And although these professors sit at different universities and have different focus areas, they are all united by their use of randomized evaluations to evaluate the impact of social programs, to really answer the question of which social programs and policies are effective. And J-PAL affiliated researchers have experience conducting these randomized evaluations in the field, with all the complexities and challenges of doing policy-relevant research in the real world. Now that I've introduced J-PAL's work, I'd like to introduce the work of the J-PAL Education Technology and Opportunity Initiative. Launched in 2018, JPAL North America's Education Technology and Opportunity Initiative supports U.S. education leaders in generating rigorous evidence on how and to what extent uses of technology and innovation can improve student learning. So our goals are to help education understand if the programs they are using are effective and to more broadly generate a rigorous body of evidence on approaches that truly move the dial. And we are hoping through this initiative to really shine a spotlight on education leaders who are committed to using rigorous evidence in decision-making related to education technology. I've talked about JPAL and our focus on reducing poverty. So why are we as an organization invested in education technology as a policy area? For folks on the call, you all know that education has long been viewed as a springboard to a productive, more fulfilling life. Beyond well-documented returns on earnings, education is also associated with other positive outcomes, including improved health care and reduced involvement with the criminal justice system. Over the past decade, there's been an overall rise in educational attainment in the United States. But despite this progress, we find that tremendous inequality in student learning persists in the United States. For example, the most and least socioeconomically advantaged districts have average performance levels more than 4 grade levels apart. In light of many of these long-standing challenges in education, many policymakers and practitioners are looking to technology to move the dial on challenges that we've long considered intractable. And broadly defined, education technology is any use of technology that can be used to support student learning and improve student outcomes. And in many ways, technology has already changed how students learn. Think about how a college student today might work on a paper. The student likely would receive the assignment via email, text classmates to discuss the paper, consult Google for information, type up the assignment, and submit it online. But think about this 40 years ago. This type of interaction with technology 40 years ago was probably a pipe dream even for the most tech-savvy student. Today, education technology has grown into a tremendously lucrative global industry. And in the United States alone, hardware and software for schools is estimated to be worth $21 billion by 2020. And for nearly every challenge that we see in education, there is a proposed technological solution, whether you're a student who's sitting in an urban after-school program or a teacher sitting in a more rural setting. So the goals of the Education Technology Opportunity Initiative are multifold. We recognize and we celebrate a lot of the innovation that's been happening around education technology, but we also recognize that many programs are untested and not everything that we're going to try in education technology is going to work. And in order to harness the true potential of education technology, we need rigorous evidence to identify programs that are really going beyond the hype and are truly moving the dial on student achievement. And it's really important that we get this right. We're not just investing and testing programs for the sake of testing programs. Rather, we want to identify and invest in what works because it can help us really make massive inroads for student achievement. So our Education Technology and Opportunity Initiative hopes to achieve these goals through several different approaches. First is we are hoping to catalyze randomized evaluations of promising uses of education technology and innovation. Then we are looking to build the capacity of education leaders to use data and use evaluation. We're also hoping to create a cohort of leaders who advance the use of rigorous evidence in education and education technology. And we are lastly hoping to share rigorous evidence with leaders who can act on this research to generate solutions to critical challenges in education. So as I mentioned earlier, we're not only committed to generating rigorous research and evidence for the sake of generating rigorous research and evidence. Rather, we are really hoping to catalyze policy change and action through rigorous scientific evidence. So you've heard me talk a little bit about randomized evaluations, so I want to walk you through what randomized evaluations are specifically. Randomized evaluations are one of the many tools to measure the impact of programs. And when done correctly, randomized evaluations can be a very powerful way to answer the question, what is the effect of your program? And you can think of randomized evaluations as the same methodological approach that was used to revolutionize modern medicine. We at JPAL specialize in the use of randomized evaluations. It is our bread and butter, but we certainly do not advocate for the use of randomized evaluations in every setting. Some organizations may have programs that are not quite mature enough for randomized evaluation, and our role here at JPAL is to help you figure out what evaluation method would be appropriate depending on the question that you're trying to answer and the context in which you are working. So how does a randomized evaluation work in practice, and what is it? So let's walk through a very simple example of a randomized evaluation. Let's say you're a district administrator who's interested in measuring the impact of a new, untested online computer program on student math scores. You would first start by picking the population that is eligible to receive the program. And then you would then split the eligible population into two groups at random, let's say through a lottery. One group would receive the online computer program. In this case, we call it the treatment. And the other group would continue receiving the status quo. In this case, we call it the control group. And if randomization is done correctly, then the two groups will be statistically identical to one another on average, except for the fact that one group received the computer program. In other words, a randomized evaluation allows you to make an apples-to-apples comparison. After a period of time, you can compare math test scores between the two groups. And because you know that the two groups are statistically the same, any difference in math scores can be attributed to the program and not to some other reason, for example, better teachers or per pupil spending. And for this reason, randomized evaluations can generate very clear and convincing evidence to answer the question of what is the impact of your program. So this simple example is only one example of how a randomized evaluation could work. Randomized evaluations in education could work in many different ways. For example, you could think about conducting a randomized evaluation at the student level, the classroom level, or the school level, to name a few options. You can even have multiple treatment groups, depending on the research questions that you are hoping to answer. So when would you consider doing a randomized evaluation? I've indicated a few level talking points that you can think through here. First is if you have an unstudied or understudied program. For example, a program that has not yet been rigorously evaluated, and you're really interested to understand the causal impact of this program. We also sometimes look at programs that are oversubscribed. If you can't serve everybody who is eligible for the program, what is the optimal way to allocate spots? Sometimes the fairest way to actually determine who is given a program is through a randomized lottery, especially when there are not enough spots for every single student or teacher or household. We also look at a lot of programs that are considering expansion. So let's say you know of a program that is well-defined that's been tried elsewhere. When you're introducing an existing program to a new area, you have an opportunity to truly test its impact in a new location. You can build in randomization as it's being rolled out, and you can use a lottery to determine who receives the program as you roll it out into a new place. In other instances, you can also add a new feature of a program. Let's say if you already have an existing program and you're trying to test the impact of the additional feature or a new model of this program, you can think of randomly assigning some folks to use the new version of the program compared to the old version of the program. And also, if you have a program threshold or a cutoff, if you currently have a sharp cutoff criteria, such as a minimum GPA to get into a program, and you're interested in the impact of a program, you can use this opportunity to test the impact of kids right around the cutoff through randomization. Of course, different methods of randomization can answer different research questions, and it really depends on your specific case. And beyond any of the information that I shared with you right now, I think the main takeaway is if you do have any questions about whether or not your program is a good fit for a randomized evaluation, I strongly encourage you to reach out to us here at JPAL and schedule a 30-minute phone call with us, during which we can really answer some more specific questions about whether or not a randomized evaluation is a good fit for you. So really consider us a resource in this case. I've talked a bit about when a randomized evaluation makes sense, but I've also mentioned that a randomized evaluation is not the best fit for every single research question that you want to answer. And in some cases, you might want to use other different types of methods to track the impact. So when does a randomized evaluation not make sense? One is if it's too small. If your sample size is too small to detect a meaningful difference in outcomes, then a randomized evaluation might not make sense at this point. Or if it's too early. In some cases, the program might not be well defined enough, or it might be too early in its development to be evaluated through a randomized evaluation. If things are constantly changing with the program, a randomized evaluation could be a bit more difficult to carry out. However, don't opt out of considering a randomized evaluation, even if your program is fairly early stage. Just because you think you're too early, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be thinking about evaluation as a long-term thing that you can pursue. It's never too early to talk about evaluation and to consider how you are going to incorporate evaluation once the intervention is defined. And as I mentioned earlier, please just reach out to us if you do have any specific questions. In some instances, it might be too late. If your program is already serving everybody and randomized evaluation wasn't already built into the program, this might not be a good fit. And lastly, if a positive impact has already been proven and you're really confident about the impact of your program, and you do have the resources to serve everybody, it would be unethical to withhold the program from people in this case, and we would not recommend doing a randomized evaluation. But of course, as I mentioned, please reach out to us if you have any specific questions. Now that I've gone over randomized evaluations in the abstract and talked a bit about JPAL's EdTech and Opportunity Initiative, I'd like to hand it over to my co-presenter, Shane DeRoll, who can talk about his experience working on a specific randomized evaluation. So Shane, we're going to hand over the presentation privileges to you now.
Thanks, Vincent. And thanks to all our guests for joining us today. My name is Shane DeRoll. I'm the founder and CEO of Big Word Club, an evidence-based digital learning company that's committed to improving the vocabularies of every kid in America. What's the big deal about vocabulary, you might be thinking? Well, unless you're a vocabulary nerd like me, you probably don't know what an incredibly important role vocabulary plays and has played in your life. But that's about to change. Some interesting stats fresh off the presses and complete with footnotes. A child's vocabulary growth is directly connected to his or her overall school achievement. The size of a child's vocabulary in kindergarten predicts his ability to learn to read. And a person's vocabulary level is the single best predictor of occupational success. Connected to overall school achievement, ability to learn to read, and the best predictor of occupational success. And my personal favorite, as E.D. Hirsch Jr. so eloquently states, simply put, knowing more words makes you smarter. Sort of says it all, right? Closing the word gap. As a children's book author, I'm embarrassed to say that until 4 years ago, I never even heard of the word gap, and now I've committed the rest of my professional life to help close it. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? We begin this slide with a strong declaration. There is a word gap in America between rich and poor. But what is the word gap? The word gap is the term used to describe the results of a landmark study in 1995 by Betty Hart and Todd Risley that said that poor kids may hear as many as 30 million fewer words than more privileged kids by the time they're 3 years old. This word gap translates to a gap in the vocabularies between rich and poor kids of between 400 and 700 words by the time they enter preschool. So what happens to these millions of kids who know hundreds of fewer words than their classmates when they begin school? They start behind. And research tells us that kids who start behind tend to stay behind. These kids never catch up. They never reach their potential. If true, it seems tragically unfair that the die is cast in terms of a child's future by the time he or she is 3 years old. As a country, we can and must do better. And as a company, that's exactly what Big Word Club is committed to doing. Big Word Club goals, simple and audacious. We believe that an improved vocabulary leads to an improved life. It's as simple as that. And everything we do is towards that end. From the very beginning, we set out to create a vocabulary intervention that kids loved, was fast, fun, and easy to implement by both teacher and parent, was easily scalable and inexpensive, and improved the vocabularies of preschool and kindergarten students. In other words, it worked. And that's exactly what we did with Big Word Club. Problem was, nobody believed us. Turns out anecdotal evidence doesn't carry much water in the education market. Despite the fact that we successfully launched a pilot in over 1,000 preschool and kindergarten classrooms to raise reviews and converted 20% of our pilot teachers into paid subscribers, the truth was we lacked the scientific evidence we needed to provide school districts with the confidence to buy Big Word Club for its students. It was about this time that I met Vincent at JPAL and explained our situation. Here was my pitch. Vincent, I said, every year, millions of kids from lower socioeconomic homes enter preschool and kindergarten knowing hundreds of fewer words than their more privileged classmates. Kids who start behind tend to stay behind, and these kids never reach their potential. We believe Big Word Club can help them, and we'd like your help to prove it. Fortunately, Vincent and JPAL agreed that the promise of Big Word Club was worth the cost of funding a randomized evaluation and assembled a world-class team from the University of Chicago and University of Toronto to implement the evaluation. And the rest was, as they say, randomized evaluation history. The benefits of a randomized evaluation. For us, it was quite simple. Get the evidence that Big Word Club works, or shut it down and stop wasting everyone's time and money. Fortunately, the results of the evaluation were good and full of exciting observations. You'll hear more about those results from our next presenters. Having this evidence has proven invaluable in terms of sales and fundraising. Another unexpected but wonderful benefit of the evaluation was that we learned how to develop future content that will further improve Big Word Club's impact on children's vocabularies. Some of the Big Word Club audience can read, but most can't. To make Big Word Club relevant to both groups, we use both the written and spoken word, music, and animation to create our book, song, and dance videos that introduce kids to a new big word every day of the school year. Here's an overview of how it works. We begin each day with Big Word of the Day. It's an animated video that introduces preschool and early elementary school kids to a new big word every day of the school year in less than 1 minute. In the Big Word of the Day, kids see and hear each day's big words spelled correctly and phonetically, defined, and used in a sentence. Those 5 words are then reinforced throughout the week in an animated book, song, and dance. And we wrap it all up at the end of the week with a Big Word Club review in which we reprise the definition of the 5 big words of the day for that week and challenge kids to use one or more of these big words in their own sentences. As you see here, the words we chose for this particular slide were symbiotic. And this is both in our preschool to kindergarten grade level. And so let me tell you a quick funny story about something a kindergarten teacher shared with us. She was teaching her class about friendship. She asked, What does it mean to be a friend? One little boy jumped out of his seat and said, I know. It means they're symbiotic. They help each other. Not bad for kindergarten, right? Well, I'd like to pass the baton to Ariel Khalil from the BIP lab at the University of Chicago, who will take it from here. Thanks for listening.
Hi, everybody. This is Ariel Khalil, and I'm just going to make a brief introduction to the Behavioral Insights and Parenting Lab and our evaluation of the Big Word Club, representing for the moment my colleagues Susan Mayer and Phil Oreopoulos. And as I said, I'm just going to introduce what our objective of the evaluation of the Big Word Club was. And in particular, it was to compare the receptive vocabulary of students in classrooms with access to the Big Word Club to the receptive vocabulary of those students who did not get access to the Big Word Club. But, and just so you're all aware, receptive vocabulary is the number of words a child can understand, even if the child cannot produce that particular word on a test. But as in all the work we do at the lab, we want to understand not only what is the impact of an offer to participate in a program like the Big Word Club, that is the treatment impact, but also try to understand the mechanisms. Why do we get the results that we do get? And I'll just say very briefly before I turn it over to my colleague Susan Mayer, how we actually conducted this evaluation. So first, we needed to recruit a sufficient number of schools so that we would have the power to detect any treatment impacts. And we recruited 53 schools, half of whom we randomly assigned to get the treatment, that is, to get access to the Big Word Club, and half to a control group. Those teachers who were randomly assigned to the treatment group were given access to the Big Word Club. And after some number of weeks, we assessed the receptive vocabulary of the students in all the schools with the goal of assessing average differences in receptive vocabulary across those two groups of students. And I am now going to turn it over to my colleague Susan Mayer, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how we actually recruited those schools and how we conducted the data collection and the data analysis.
Hello, everyone. I hope I'm now unmuted. Thank you for joining this webinar. We begin this evaluation, as all evaluations must begin, by selecting a sample. In this particular case, we were really lucky because Shane, the founder of Big Word Club, had an incredible network from which he recruited teachers. He ran a Facebook campaign to ask people to volunteer, ask teachers to volunteer to participate in an evaluation, and 637 teachers responded with interest to that evaluation, which was pretty astounding. These were all over the country. We couldn't travel all over the country to do the intervention because we had to evaluate students, which means we had to test students in every single school. So we needed some geographic proximity to reduce costs. And it turned out that 260 schools were in clusters in Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. We then eliminated some schools for specific reasons. We eliminated schools, we eliminated classrooms in which there were only special needs students because we didn't have assessors qualified to assess such students. We also eliminated home-based child care because they were very small. Some of the home-based child care centers are 3 to 5 children. It would have been very expensive to travel to all of those. And we eliminated schools more than 100 miles from main cities in Arizona, Colorado, and Texas, again, for logistical reasons. After that, we were left with 96 schools, and we sent an email and a letter to the principals in those schools outlining what would be entailed in participating in an evaluation and asking them if that was indeed okay with them. And then only 53 schools then agreed to that, some of them because it would take a very long time to get parental consent and sometimes for other reasons as well. So we had 53 schools. We had done a power analysis before starting the recruiting schools. This is also a crucial part of doing an RCT. It's how you estimate how many participants you need, either schools, classrooms, or individuals, and we knew this was likely to be enough schools, so that meant we could start the evaluation. After we had randomized schools, 6 dropped out. That happens in the real world. Not everything goes as smoothly as you hope, and so we were left with 47 schools. Great. Okay, so we divided the schools into treatment schools and control schools, randomly, of course. And we also, at this particular point in time, developed our assessment tools so that we would know in the end whether students who had or teachers who had access to the Big Word Club had students who scored higher on vocabulary tests. So we had 2 different kinds of tests, and we tested in 2 different periods of time. The 2 different kinds of tests were, 1, a test of the specific vocabulary that is in the Big Word Club. So we took the first 16 weeks of the Big Word Club and created an assessment tool using that. After 17 weeks of teachers having access to the Big Word Club, we administered that assessment for all students. And then at 25 weeks after teachers first had access to the Big Word Club, we again administered that same assessment tool. In addition to that, at 25 weeks, we assessed students using a standardized and well-regarded test of receptive vocabulary, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. So we had one test of the words in the Big Word Club and another test of the using a standardized measure of vocabulary. So for most measures of, or most estimates of the difference between the treatment and control group, we also control for covariates. This is also an important part of any RCT or any RCT that we do, partly because you need to know that the treatment group and the control group actually do have the same observable characteristics. That gives you confidence that there aren't any systematic differences between those groups that could affect the vocabulary test scores. And in addition, in most of our models, we control for covariates because, again, it increases the reliability of the models that we estimate. So in this particular one, we had data from the schools and some data from the teachers on the state, the kind of school, the characteristics of the students and the characteristics of the students in the school, average characteristics. And fortunately for us, and if you have a big enough number, it usually turns out to be the case, the treatment and the control groups were balanced. That is, they didn't differ in any systematic way on any observable measure that we had. So at the 17-week assessment, we found that the average score for the treatment groups combined was 24.1 words out of 37 words that were, out of 38 words that were available to be learned in that first 17 weeks of teachers having access to the Big Word Club. The minimum was 7 words and the maximum was 37 words. That was the average across both groups. When we compare the treatment group and the control group, we found that the treatment group students identified, depending on the model, between let's call it 1.2 and 1.6 more words than the control group. And that was equivalent to an effect size of between 2.98 standard deviations and 0.320 standard deviations, again, depending on the model. At 25 weeks, the results were more or less the same, so I won't go over those. It just shows that over the short term, the gains were retained. At 25 weeks, as I said, we administered the PPVT. Here, treatment students identified about 1.5 to 2.5 more words compared to the control group, but because the PPVT has many more words in it than the 38 words we had in our assessment, that resulted in an effect size of 0.109 to 0.158 standard deviations. Those results were not statistically significant at the p.05 level, although because of the big confidence intervals, it suggests there could be a substantial effect of the Big Word Club on the PPVT. All the other results that we got were statistically significant at the same level of significance. So then we wanted to know, well, these are pretty promising results, but why didn't students learn more words? And there were 2 categories of things that we looked at. One was whether teachers actually used the Big Word Club, and the second was the content of the words in the Big Word Club itself. So we were able to find out how much teachers used the Big Word Club because their login was tracked at the back end of the Big Word Club platform. And so that was very, very useful to us. And we also were able to interview teachers in a separate survey. On the content of the Big Word Club, we were able to do an item analysis of the words that were in it. So, to whether teachers use the Big Word Club, and this is a little bit of a cautionary tale, I think, for technology in the classroom. Teachers started out using the Big Word Club more than they ended up using it. They used it on average 0.7 times per potential school day. If everybody had used it as intended, it would have been closer to 1 time per potential school day. And that number dropped over time. And it dropped over time partly because teachers got very busy. By the end of the test period, it was the very tail end of the school year, and so teachers were very busy with other things. Teachers also have their own routines, so it's very hard to get them to change their routines to integrate technology into any program, and especially because these were volunteer teachers that weren't feeling much pressure from their school districts to use the Big Word Club. So there was not full and consistent use of the Big Word Club. Teachers said their main reason for not using it was that they had too many other activities. Again, not unexpected. Another interesting thing we found in the teacher interviews, and I think this is also important, is that teachers way overestimated the amount that students learned from the Big Word Club or would learn from the Big Word Club. So over half of the teachers that we interviewed estimated that students learned between 6 and 12 words as opposed to the 1 or 2 words that they actually did learn. But in the end, even though teacher use of the Big Word Club dropped off, teachers were very interested in using it. They really did like the Big Word Club, and they really did like using it. On to the content of the Big Word Club. It doesn't go without saying, because I think many people don't think about this, but students can only learn new words if they don't already know the word. So if you had a vocabulary intervention in which all the control kids already knew all the words, it would be very hard for the treatment group to have learned more words compared to the control group. So over 50% of the control group students could identify 26 of the 38 words in the Big Word Club assessment. So when I say one or two students learned one or two words, it was not out of the 38 words, because a whole lot of those words everybody already knew. It was more like out of the 10 words that lots of students didn't already know. So, the second point is just that over 80% of the control group kids could identify 12 or more of the Big Word Club words. So the more words that you start with that nobody knows, that means the control group wouldn't know them either, the more room for learning there actually is. So again, almost all of the gains by the treatment group came from the words least likely to be known by the control students. So that's not a surprise. For the 10 words that most control kids already knew, there was almost no chance that the treatment kids were going to exceed the control kids on those words. For the words that the control group was least likely to know, the chance was 80% that there was a difference between treatment and control kids. So all the learning came from the words least likely to be known by the control kids. And within that group of words, the treatment kids really learned a lot more words. So it's not enough just to say that a program works or doesn't work, because different programs might have the same benefit to students but cost very different amounts. And so ideally, what any school district would want is a program that works really well and is low cost. They would prefer that to a program that works equally well but is very expensive. So we tried to look around at other comparable programs to see whether to find programs that had a similar intent and what the benefit to those programs were and what those programs might cost. It's actually hard to do that because programs don't often put in the actual cost of the programs. But two that struck us as being very, very similar in intent to the Big Word Club are one called Elements of Reading and another one, KPAV. One of those had no effect after 2 years. One had an effect in the similar range to the effect of Big Word Club on the PPVT. But both of those required teacher training and other important costs, so they were both considerably more expensive than the Big Word Club. So compared to other similar programs, the Big Word Club is cost-effective. It's a cost-effective way to increase vocabulary, and its measured benefits are likely to be even larger with a somewhat different word selection and with greater fidelity by teachers to implementation. Both of those seem fairly easy to achieve. And so with that, I will turn this back to Vincent. Or at least I will try to.
Great. Thank you very much, Shane, Ariel, and Susan, for that helpful and really insightful overview of a randomized evaluation in practice. So I'm going to spend the remainder of the presentation today talking about how to actually apply for the Education Technology and Opportunity Innovation Competition. So through this competition, K through 12 education leaders can apply for pro bono technical support, trainings about data and evaluation, connections with JPAL's network of leading academic researchers to run the study, and also up to $50,000 in flexible funding. The goal of this competition is to identify and incubate promising ideas for evaluation and help education leaders develop these ideas into full randomized evaluation in close partnership with JPAL staff and affiliated academic researchers. So why structure this as a competition? Well, as decision makers and practitioners, you have the most insight into policy-relevant questions that you would like to answer. Yet, we recognize that even the most committed education leaders may not have the technical expertise, resources, or connections to leading and experienced research to carry out a high-quality evaluation. And this competition is really intended to bridge the gap between education decision makers and education researchers. And in order to do so, the competition is inviting K through 12 education leaders to apply for what I've just mentioned. So who is eligible to apply for this competition? Organizations serving K through 12, including school districts, school networks, local, state, and education agencies, charters, and education nonprofits are all eligible to apply for this competition. For-profit edtech companies who are partnering with any of the aforementioned categories may also apply jointly to this competition. We mentioned here that you can also apply for up to $50,000 in flexible funding. This funding is meant to cover the costs associated with preparing for an evaluation. For example, it can help support an employee who's spending a percentage of her time preparing for an evaluation, but it should not be used to cover the cost of buying new technology or new software. For the initial letter of interest, there's no need to prepare a budget. We'll ask applicants at the finalist stage to prepare a budget if they are seeking funding. The core thing that selected partners really receive through this competition are the connections to JPAL staff and researchers, such as folks like Ariel Khalil and Susan Mayer on this call. And to be part of a cohort of education leaders who are really committed to generating rigorous evidence about the impacts of education technology, and really being part of a network who can share lessons with one another about how to generate additional evidence in this field. So walking through the letter of interest specifically, when we talk about EdTech and innovation, we define EdTech and innovation quite broadly. Topics could include computer-assisted learning, software, low-cost technologies, and also online learning. But we know that there are many uses of education and technology and innovation that we have not yet identified, and that may be very valuable to evaluate. And I think that's why we're so excited about this competition in particular, is because we can solicit really exciting ideas from folks who are really trying out the most cutting-edge innovations in education and working with them to really evaluate their impact. If you do have questions about whether a specific program, initiative, or approach is a good fit for the competition, please don't hesitate to reach out to us to schedule a 30-minute phone call. For this year in particular, we're really interested in uses of technology that are being incorporated as part of an instructional model. And to apply, please submit a 3- to 5-page letter of interest describing the policy question or challenge that motivates your application, the program that you would like to evaluate, how many people are currently being reached or do you plan to reach, potential opportunities for randomized evaluation, and access to data for measuring outcomes. Applications are due on April 1st of this year. From mid-April to late April, finalists will be invited for interviews and asked to submit additional information, including a proposed budget. We plan to announce the winners in early June. And for more information, please feel free to visit the URL to get information on specific details of the competition. What are some characteristics of a strong application? Well, first of all, we're looking for potential to actually meaningfully improve educational outcomes through technology and innovation, and also the potential to scale. This may go without saying, but we are really interested in evaluating programs not for the sake of evaluating programs, but because we really want to be able to help disadvantaged students in particular. The letter of interest should clearly describe the program that you are trying to evaluate. For example, if you're interested in testing the impact of the new text-based family engagement program, the letter of interest should clearly explain the components and scope of this program. And you should also clearly explain outcomes of interest that you may be interested in capturing. Also, we are looking for ideas that are ultimately feasible. So you should explain the scope of this program and whether or not you have the types of commitment from institutional leaders to carry out this study. But of course, if you do have any questions about whether or not an idea would make for a strong application, I know that I've mentioned this several times, but we really do encourage folks to reach out with specific questions. I also want to point you all to a new resource that we put out. We recently published a J-PAL Education Technology Evidence Review, which summarizes over 126 experimental studies across 4 broad categories of education technology, from access to technology and hardware, to computer-assisted learning and educational software, to online learning, to low-cost technology-based nudges in education. Please consider this as a resource if you're thinking through what the current evidence base actually says about a given program. Chances are that this review may have addressed it. So we have about 5 minutes for question and answer. So let me take a look very quickly at some of the questions that we got from the audience during the webinar. So this question is actually for Ariel and Susan. What types of organizations do research groups like BIP try to partner with? And are there any key practices or characteristics that make certain organizations easier or more attractive to partner with on academic research?
Hi, this is Ariel. I'll answer a little bit first, and I'll let Susan add. We are delighted to partner with organizations who are, well, first of all, curious and open, as Shane was, to the landscape of possibilities that an evaluation might come up with. It's especially important for us that we work together to make sure that we have the right kind of outcome data. So organizations that have partnerships, let's just give schools as an example, to get school record data or school administrative data is very appealing. Or that, the alternative is for us, as we did with the Big Word Club, to collect the outcome data ourselves, an original testing of kids' skills. There are pros and cons to both kinds of data. Some are more expensive and easier to get than others. But that's something that is appealing to us.
I'm not sure I can actually add too much to that. I think the word curious is the most important one. Organizations that sincerely want to know and understand the innovation that they've created. That's really important to us.
Great. Another question that we had was whether or not the competition is open to regions outside of North America. This competition is focused exclusively on education, technology, and innovation in the United States region. One other question is for Shane at Big Word Club. Shane, do you have any advice on how organizations such as the folks on this call can better prepare to be involved in an RCT?
That's a good one. I think, truthfully, the answer is sort of twofold. One is that you need to identify a real need on your side of the fence for an RCT. And secondly, you need to be willing to live with the consequences, whatever they are. And those are the two big sort of areas of prep that I would say are absolutely essential in preparation for undergoing or consideration of an RCT.
Fantastic. And let me take a quick look through the questions again. Shane, this is also another question for you. How have the findings from the evaluation impacted the way that you run your current program?
Hello? I seem to be, oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, on the one hand, it has no impact directly on how we deliver the program, how the program is designed to be implemented in the classroom or home level. But I think the big gain for us was that the credibility gained as a result of the RCT has been phenomenal in two areas primarily. One, in sales, in that we now have the credibility of being an evidence-based intervention that has been funded by JPAL, leading research center based at MIT, and the University of Chicago and the University of Toronto. So that's profound both from a sales perspective and a fundraising perspective, because we are essentially in startup mode, because for the last 18 months that we've been committed to this RCT, we were really waiting to learn. Does this work? And if it doesn't, what can we do to make it work? And what we also learned as a result of this RCT is what we can do. It does work, but what we can do to make it work better in the future. So all those things are a part of it moving forward.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one more short question. So one question that we also received was whether or not there's a recommended sample size for an EdTech study. The short answer is that it really depends on what you're interested in measuring, what outcomes you're going to be looking at, and what assumptions go into your study. So I would recommend folks with questions related to sample size to actually reach out to us directly, and we can give a more specific response. But as a general rule of thumb, I would say that if you're looking only at 1 or 2 schools for a particular study, that's probably going to be too small of a sample size. But please do reach out to us if you have specific questions. And I want to note that we also will follow up with others via email because we weren't able to get to all of the questions today. So thank you, everybody, for spending your Friday afternoon with us. I'm really excited about this round of our Education Technology and Innovation competition. And I once again wanted to thank Shane, Ariel, and Susan for joining us and presenting about the research with the Big Word Club. So thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend. And once again, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website within about a week. Thank you very much.